Hey everyone, today I want to tell you a very intense story about a quiet new student who was bullied every single day until the moment his father walked into our school and everything changed. I thought the new kid would disappear within a week. Most new students did. Our school had a way of crushing people who didn't fit in. But this time, we were all wrong. Because 3 weeks later, something happened in our classroom that nobody could have predicted. And the worst part? By the time we realized the truth about that boy, it was already too late. My name is Ryan Carter, and at the time I was a junior at Westbrook High. Nothing special ever happened there. Same classes, same teachers, same loud cafeteria, same football players acting like kings of the world. Until the day Daniel Brooks showed up. I still remember the first moment I saw him. He walked into class late on a rainy Monday morning. His clothes were simple: old hoodie, worn backpack. His hair looked like he had cut it himself. He didn't look at anyone. Not once. Our teacher, Mrs. Kellerman, introduced him quickly. "This is Daniel. He just transferred here. Please make him feel welcome." But the second she turned back to the board, the whispers started. Someone behind me laughed quietly. "Another loser." Another voice said, "Dude looks like he hasn't slept in a year." Daniel quietly walked to the empty desk in the back corner of the classroom. He didn't argue. He didn't react. He just sat down and stared at the desk like the rest of us didn't exist. That was the first strange thing. Most new kids try to fit in. They try to smile, talk, impress people. Daniel did none of that. And I didn't know it yet, but that silence was hiding something much bigger. At lunch, things got worse. Westbrook Cafeteria had its own invisible map. The athletes at the center tables, the popular kids near the windows, everyone else scattered around the edges. Daniel walked in slowly, holding a lunch tray. And instantly, people noticed him. Kyle Maddox noticed him first. If you knew Westbrook High, you knew Kyle. Football captain, loud, confident, the kind of guy teachers loved and students feared. Kyle looked at Daniel's tray and smirked. "Well, look who showed up." His friends laughed. Daniel tried to walk past them. "Bad idea." Kyle stuck his foot out slightly. Daniel tripped. The tray crashed to the floor. Milk spilled everywhere. The entire cafeteria exploded with laughter. Daniel stayed on the floor for a second. Then he quietly started picking up the food. No anger, no yelling, just silence. And that was the second strange thing, because most people would react, but Daniel didn't. Kyle leaned down and whispered something I barely heard. "Maybe this school isn't for you." Daniel froze for a moment. Then he stood up slowly and walked away without saying a single word. I remember watching him leave the cafeteria. Something about the way he moved felt different. Not scared, not angry, just calm. Almost like he already knew something we didn't. Over the next few days, the bullying got worse. Books knocked out of his hands, people bumping into him in the hallway, cruel jokes whispered behind his back. But Daniel never reacted, not once. And that started to bother me. Because people who are scared eventually break. But Daniel never did. And one afternoon, I accidentally noticed something that made me feel uneasy. Daniel wasn't just ignoring everyone. He was watching the hallways, watching the teachers, watching the exits, like he was studying the entire school. At the time, I told myself I was imagining things. But a week later, something happened that proved I wasn't. And it started with a phone call Daniel received during lunch. A phone call that made his face change for the first time since he arrived. The cafeteria was louder than usual that day. Trays slamming students, yelling across tables, and someone blasting music from their phone near the vending machines. In the middle of all that chaos, Daniel was sitting alone in the same corner he always chose. Nobody sat near him anymore, not because they respected him, but because Kyle and his friends had turned him into the school joke. But that afternoon, something unusual happened. Daniel's phone rang. I noticed it instantly because Daniel had never used his phone before, not during class, not in the hallways, not even during lunch. The screen lit up in his hand, and for a moment he just stared at it like he was deciding something important. Then he answered quietly. "Hello?" His voice was calm, almost too calm for someone surrounded by noise and laughter. He listened for a few seconds and his expression changed slightly. Not fear, not surprise, something more serious. "Yeah," he said softly, "I understand." He slowly looked around the cafeteria as if he was checking something. Then he spoke again. "No, it hasn't happened yet." Those words gave me chills, even though I didn't know why. Maybe it was the way he said them. Very precise, very controlled, like someone reporting information. After another pause, he nodded slightly and said, "Okay, I'll handle it." Then he ended the call and placed the phone on the table. For a moment, he just sat there staring at the surface like he was thinking. And that's when Kyle walked over. Of course he did. Kyle never ignored an opportunity to embarrass someone weaker. "Well, look at this," Kyle said loudly. "The ghost actually has friends." His buddies burst out laughing behind him. Daniel didn't even look up. Kyle grabbed the phone from the table before Daniel could react. "Who were you talking to?" he mocked, waving it around. No answer. Kyle leaned closer and shook the phone slightly. "What's wrong, cat? Got your tongue?" Students nearby started watching the scene. I noticed Daniel's hands under the table slowly clenching into fists. But when he spoke, his voice stayed perfectly calm. "Give it back." Kyle grinned like he had just won a game. "Oh, he talks now." He turned the phone around, pretending to examine the screen. "Let's see who your little friend is." He tried to unlock it, but the screen stayed black. And that's when Daniel stood up. Slowly, very slowly, like he was forcing himself to stay in control. "Give it back," he repeated quietly. Something about the way he said those words made the laughter around us fade a little. Even Kyle noticed the shift, but Kyle wasn't the kind of person who backed down in front of an audience. Instead, he smirked and leaned closer. Or what he said. For a second, nobody moved. Then Kyle suddenly shoved Daniel hard in the chest. Daniel stumbled backward and hit the edge of the table behind him. The cafeteria fell silent for a moment. For the first time since he arrived, Daniel looked angry. Not loud angry, not emotional angry, but something colder and more controlled. And that's when something even stranger happened. Instead of attacking Kyle, Daniel looked at the clock on the cafeteria wall. Exactly 12:42 p.m. Then he looked back at Kyle and said something so quietly that only the closest tables could hear it. "You shouldn't have done that." Kyle laughed again and tossed the phone onto the floor. "Pick it up, loser," he said. Daniel bent down, picked up the phone, and checked the screen. Then he walked out of the cafeteria without saying another word. A few seconds later, the noise returned like nothing had happened. Kyle shrugged and went back to his table. But I couldn't stop thinking about the words Daniel said on the phone earlier. "It hasn't happened yet." I kept repeating them in my head for the rest of the day. And later that afternoon, something happened outside the school building that made those words terrifying. Because at exactly 1:10 p.m., a long black car slowly pulled into the school parking lot. At first, nobody paid attention, but then the driver stepped out and opened the back door. And the man who walked out of that car was someone none of us expected to see at a place like Westbrook High. Not the teachers, not the principal, not even Daniel himself. But when Daniel saw who it was standing near the school entrance, his face suddenly turned completely pale. And in that moment, I realized something was about to happen that would change our entire school forever. After lunch, the entire school felt strangely tense, even though nobody could explain why. Classes continued like normal teachers, talking, students pretending to listen, chairs scraping across the floor, but I couldn't stop thinking about the moment in the cafeteria, the way Daniel had looked at the clock. The way he said, "You shouldn't have done that." It didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like a warning. And something about that warning stayed in my mind the entire afternoon. When the final bell rang, most students rushed toward the exits like always, laughing, shouting, planning their evening. I was walking down the main hallway when I noticed Daniel again. He was standing near the glass doors that led outside to the parking lot. He wasn't leaving. He was watching. His eyes were fixed on something outside, and his posture was completely still, like he had been waiting there for a long time. I followed his gaze through the glass, and that's when I saw the car. A long black car had just slowly pulled into the parking lot. It looked expensive and completely out of place, surrounded by old student cars and yellow buses. The engine stopped, and for a few seconds nothing happened. Then the driver stepped out. He was wearing a dark suit and sunglasses, even though the sky was cloudy. He walked around the car and opened the back door with careful precision, like someone trained to do it perfectly every time. And then, a man stepped out. At first, he looked like a normal businessman, tall, serious, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit. But the moment he stood up straight, something about his presence changed the atmosphere completely. Even from inside the building, I could feel it. Students walking past the entrance slowed down slightly, like they were noticing him without understanding why. The man looked around the parking lot calmly, then his eyes moved toward the school doors. Toward us. Toward Daniel. For the first time since he arrived at Westbrook High, Daniel looked nervous. Not scared exactly, but tense, like someone who knew a moment he couldn't avoid had finally arrived. He stepped outside before the man even started walking. I hesitated for a second, then quietly followed a few steps behind, staying close to the door so I could still hear them. The man stopped in front of Daniel and studied him carefully. There was a long silence between them, like both of them were measuring something invisible. Finally, the man spoke. "Daniel," he said slowly, "you were supposed to call me earlier." Daniel looked down briefly, then back up. "I handled it," he replied quietly. The man's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened. "Did you?" he asked. For a moment, neither of them spoke again. I felt like I was watching something important, but I didn't understand what it was yet. Then the man glanced past Daniel toward the school building and the groups of students leaving through the doors. His eyes moved slowly, scanning the area like he was studying everything. "Is this where it happened?" he asked calmly. Daniel nodded once. "Yes." The man looked back at him. And the boy Daniel Brooks, who had been silent for weeks, suddenly looked like a completely different person. His voice became firm and serious. "They pushed too far today," he said. The man was quiet for a moment, then asked a question that made my stomach tighten. "Which one?" he said. Daniel didn't hesitate. "Kyle Maddox," he answered. The man slowly turned his head toward the football field where a group of players were walking across the grass, laughing loudly. Even from far away, Kyle was easy to recognize. Big, confident, always the center of attention. The man watched him for several seconds. Then he said something so calmly that it sounded even more dangerous. "I see." Daniel took a small step closer to him. "Dad," he said quietly, "maybe we should just leave." But the man didn't move. Instead, he straightened his jacket slightly and began walking toward the school entrance, toward the building, toward everyone inside. And that was the moment I realized something was about to happen that nobody at Westbrook High was prepared for. The man walked through the front doors like he already owned the entire building. Students who were leaving stepped aside without even realizing why. It was something about the way he moved, calm, confident, completely controlled. Daniel followed a few steps behind him, looking tense like he knew exactly what was coming next. I stayed near the hallway pretending to check my phone, but watching everything carefully. The man stopped in the center of the main hallway and looked around slowly. Lockers slammed somewhere down the corridor. Students laughed. Teachers talked. But around him, there was a strange, quiet circle forming as people noticed the unfamiliar face. Finally, a teacher approached him. It was Mr. Caldwell from the math department. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked politely. The man gave a small nod. "Yes," he said calmly. "I'm looking for the principal." Mr. Caldwell pointed down the hallway. "Office is at the end on the left." The man thanked him and started walking. Daniel followed again, silent and serious. I don't know why, but I kept following them too, staying far enough away not to be noticed. Something told me this moment was important. When they reached the principal's office, the secretary looked up from her computer, confused. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked. The man placed a small card on the desk. "Please tell him I'm here about Daniel Brooks," he said. She picked up the card, glanced at it, and suddenly her expression changed. Her posture straightened immediately. "One moment," she said quickly, before disappearing into the office. The door closed behind her. A few seconds passed. Then the door opened again very quickly. The principal stepped out himself. Mr. Harrison was normally a confident man, always smiling, always acting in control. But the moment he saw the visitor, his entire face froze. "Sir," he said quietly, "I didn't know you were coming today." The man gave a polite nod. "Neither did I," he replied. "But it seems something happened at your school that required my attention." The principal glanced nervously at Daniel, then back at the man. "I'm sure whatever the issue is, we can discuss it calmly inside my office," he said. They stepped inside and the door closed behind them. I waited outside trying to hear something, but the walls were too thick. Several minutes passed. Then suddenly the door opened again, and voices became louder. The principal looked stressed now, almost pale. "I assure you, we take bullying very seriously," he said quickly. The man stepped into the hallway again, his face calm but his eyes colder than before. "Do you?" he asked quietly. "Because from what my son told me, it seems you failed to protect him every single day he attended this school." Students walking past slowed down listening. The principal lowered his voice, trying to control the situation. "If there has been a misunderstanding," the man interrupted him. "There hasn't?" he said calmly. Then he looked down the hallway toward the gym where the football team had just entered after practice. "Good," he added softly, "because the boy responsible is still here." The principal followed his gaze and his expression suddenly filled with panic. "Sir, please, let's handle this properly," he said quickly. But the man had already started walking down the hallway. And at that moment, none of us had any idea that the next 5 minutes would become the most talked about moment in the entire history of Westbrook High. The man continued walking down the hallway toward the gym without slowing down. Students moved out of his way automatically, even though most of them didn't understand what was happening. Daniel followed behind him, looking more nervous with every step. I stayed several meters back, pretending to walk toward the lockers, but really, I was watching everything. By now, several other students had also noticed the strange scene and quietly started following at a distance. Something in the air felt different, like the calm before a storm. When we reached the entrance to the gym, the loud voices of the football team echoed through the hallway. The doors were open, and inside the players were laughing and throwing their bags onto the benches after practice. Kyle Maddox stood in the center of the room, talking loudly to his teammates like he always did. He looked confident, relaxed, completely unaware of what was about to happen. The man stopped at the gym entrance and looked inside for a moment, studying the room carefully. His eyes moved from one player to another until they landed on Kyle. Then he stepped inside. At first, nobody noticed him because the players were busy talking and joking. But after a few seconds, one of them stopped speaking and stared toward the door. The rest slowly followed his gaze. Within moments, the entire room became quiet. A tall stranger in a perfect suit standing calmly in a high school gym was not something anyone expected to see. Kyle frowned slightly, looking confused. "Can I help you?" he asked casually. The man walked a few steps closer. "Are you Kyle Maddox?" he asked calmly. Kyle shrugged slightly. "Yeah, why?" The man looked at him carefully like he was confirming something. Then he nodded once. "I'm Daniel Brooks's father," he said. A few players exchanged looks. Kyle laughed lightly like the situation was amusing. "Oh, your kid, the quiet one," he said. "Look, man, if he told you some story about me, that's not really—" The man raised one hand, slightly stopping him before he finished the sentence. "I'm not here to argue," he said quietly. The calm tone in his voice made the entire room feel colder. "I just want to understand something." Kyle crossed his arms, clearly annoyed now. "Understand what?" The man looked directly into his eyes. "Why you thought it was acceptable to bully my son every single day since he arrived." A few players shifted uncomfortably. The confidence in Kyle's posture changed slightly, but he tried to laugh it off. "Look, it was just jokes, man," he said. "High school stuff. Nothing serious." The man studied him silently for several seconds. Then he spoke again slowly. "You tripped him in the cafeteria today. You shoved him against a table. And you took his phone." The entire football team went quiet now. Kyle glanced briefly at his teammates before looking back at the man. "Okay, maybe things got a little rough," he admitted. "But it's not like he did anything about it." The man nodded once, as if that answer confirmed something important. "Exactly," he said. "That's what concerned me." Kyle frowned. "What do you mean?" The man stepped slightly closer and lowered his voice so it was calm but impossible to ignore. "My son has been trained his entire life to stay calm in situations like this," he said. Kyle looked confused now. "Trained for what?" The man's expression didn't change. "To observe," he replied. "To stay patient. And to report when something crosses a certain line." Several players exchanged uneasy glances. Kyle forced a smile, but the confidence in his voice was fading. "Look, I don't know what kind of weird speech this is, but if you're trying to scare me..." The man shook his head slowly. "I'm not trying to scare you," he said. "I'm explaining why you're about to have a very serious problem." Kyle laughed again, but this time it sounded forced. "And why would that be?" The man reached into his jacket pocket slowly. "Because when someone harms my son," he said calmly, "I don't handle it like a normal parent." The entire gym went silent. And when he pulled the object out of his pocket, every single person in the room suddenly realized this situation was much bigger than any of us had imagined. For a moment, nobody in the gym moved. Every player, every student, and even Daniel stood completely still watching the man's hand. The object he had taken from his pocket wasn't a weapon like some of us feared. It was a small leather wallet. He opened it calmly and held it up so Kyle could see inside. At first, Kyle looked confused. Then his face slowly changed. The color drained from his cheeks. "What is that?" he asked quietly. The man closed the wallet again and placed it back in his jacket. "I believe your father knows exactly what it is," he replied. Kyle swallowed and glanced around the room, suddenly unsure of himself. Some of the players shifted nervously, like they were realizing this wasn't a normal confrontation anymore. Daniel stood near the door, watching silently, his face serious but calm. The man looked back at Kyle again. "Your father works for the city council, doesn't he?" he asked calmly. Kyle nodded slowly, still confused. "Yeah, so what?" The man tilted his head slightly. "Then, I'm surprised he never taught you a very simple rule," he said. Kyle frowned. "What rule?" The man's voice remained perfectly calm. "The rule about making enemies you don't understand." The tension in the room was so thick that even the smallest sound echoed loudly. A basketball rolled slowly across the floor somewhere behind us. Kyle tried to recover his confidence and laughed awkwardly. "Look, man, if this is some kind of threat, it isn't," the man interrupted quietly. "Then what is it?" Kyle demanded. The man looked at Daniel for a moment before answering. "It's a lesson," he said. Kyle stared at him, clearly frustrated. "A lesson about what?" The man took a slow breath before speaking again. "About consequences." Several students watching from the gym entrance exchanged nervous glances. Nobody expected a situation like this to unfold in the middle of the school. Kyle looked at Daniel now as if seeing him differently for the first time. "Why didn't you say anything?" he asked. Daniel didn't answer. The man spoke instead. "Because he wanted to see how far you would go," he said calmly. Kyle looked stunned. "What do you mean?" The man's eyes hardened slightly. "My son warned the school administration twice," he said. Nothing changed. He waited again. Nothing changed. So today he finally called me. The gym was silent again. Kyle rubbed the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable now. "Look, I said I was messing around," he muttered. "It's not like I hurt him." The man stepped closer and his voice dropped slightly lower. "You humiliated him in front of hundreds of students every day," he said quietly. "That counts as harm." Kyle didn't answer. None of the players laughed anymore. They just stood there watching. Then the man straightened his jacket calmly like the conversation was already finished. "I didn't come here to punish you myself," he continued. Kyle looked relieved for a brief second, but the next sentence wiped that relief away instantly. "I came here to make sure everyone finally pays attention," he said. Kyle frowned again. "What are you talking about?" The man turned his head toward the gym entrance where the principal was now standing, watching the entire scene nervously. Behind him, 2 other adults had arrived. And the moment Kyle saw who they were, his entire expression collapsed. Because walking into the gym behind the principal were 2 people no student at Westbrook High ever expected to see inside the building. And suddenly Kyle realized this situation had just become much more serious than a simple school problem. The entire gym fell into a deeper silence the moment the 2 men stepped inside behind the principal. At first, many of us didn't recognize them, but the adults did immediately. The principal straightened his posture nervously, and stepped aside to let them pass. Both men wore dark suits and serious expressions, and the atmosphere in the room changed instantly. One of them held a folder, while the other calmly scanned the gym as if evaluating every person inside. Kyle looked confused at first, but then his face slowly lost all color. I realized he recognized them. One of the men stopped next to Daniel's father and nodded respectfully. "We came as soon as we received the call," he said. The tone of his voice was calm but official. Daniel's father nodded once. "Thank you," he replied. The principal cleared his throat nervously, trying to regain some control over the situation. "I'm sure this can be handled internally," he said quickly. "These are just students after all." But the second man opened the folder in his hands and looked directly at Kyle. "That depends," he said calmly. "Because according to the report we received, this situation involves repeated harassment, intimidation, and physical aggression inside a school environment." The entire football team stood frozen now. Kyle looked around the gym like he was trying to understand how things had escalated so quickly. "This is insane," he said quietly. "It was just stupid school stuff." Nobody answered him for a moment. Daniel's father finally spoke again. "That's exactly the problem," he said calmly. "People always call it stupid school stuff, until someone finally gets hurt." Kyle looked at Daniel again, this time with a mixture of anger and fear. "Why didn't you just fight back?" he demanded. Daniel's voice was quiet but clear when he answered. "Because that would have made me the problem too." The words hung in the air like a weight pressing down on everyone in the room. One of the suited men stepped forward slightly. "Kyle Maddox," he said firmly. "We're going to need you to come with us to the office so we can discuss this situation properly." Kyle's confidence completely collapsed now. He looked toward the principal, hoping for support, but the principal avoided his eyes. The entire gym watched in silence as Kyle slowly nodded. His teammates didn't laugh anymore. None of them even moved. The man with the folder closed it and turned toward the hallway. "Let's go," he said calmly. Kyle walked past Daniel, and for a brief second, their eyes met. The same boy who had been mocked and pushed around for weeks was now standing there calm and silent, while the entire situation had turned against his bully. Kyle looked like he wanted to say something, but no words came out. He simply walked past him toward the hallway. The rest of the football team stood there stunned, watching their leader disappear through the gym doors. When the hallway grew quiet again, Daniel's father looked around the room slowly. His voice when he spoke was calm, but strong enough for everyone to hear. "Let this be a reminder," he said. "Silence does not mean weakness. Sometimes it means someone is simply waiting for the right moment." Nobody in that gym would ever forget those words. But the strangest moment of all happened a few seconds later, when Daniel quietly looked at his father and said something none of us expected. "Dad," he said softly, "I think they finally understand now." And his father looked at him for a long moment, before giving a slow nod that somehow made the entire story feel even bigger than we first thought. Within an hour, the entire school knew something serious had happened in the gym. Rumors spread through the hallways faster than anything I had ever seen before. Some students said Kyle had been arrested right there in the building. Others whispered that the school was now under investigation. A few people even claimed Daniel's father was some kind of powerful government official. Nobody really knew the full truth yet, but one thing became clear very quickly. Daniel Brooks was not the quiet, powerless kid everyone thought he was. The next morning, the atmosphere at Westbrook High felt completely different. Normally, the hallways were loud, chaotic, and full of shouting, but that day the noise felt lower, almost cautious. Students whispered when Daniel walked past them, but this time nobody laughed. Nobody pushed him. Nobody even tried to get close enough to bother him. It was like the entire school had suddenly realized a mistake had been made, and nobody wanted to be the next person involved in it. Kyle wasn't in class that day, or the day after. In fact, nobody saw him again that week. Eventually, the story spread that his parents had pulled him out of Westbrook High, while the situation was being reviewed by the school administration and other authorities. His friends stopped talking about him almost immediately, like they were trying to distance themselves from the entire situation. Even the football team practiced quietly, without their usual loud confidence. It felt like a storm had passed through the building and left everyone thinking carefully about their own behavior. Daniel, however, stayed exactly the same as before. He sat in the back of the classroom, calm, quiet, and focused on his work like nothing unusual had happened. He didn't act proud. He didn't brag. He didn't even talk about what happened in the gym. It was like the entire event meant nothing to him. That was probably the strangest part of the whole story. One afternoon after class, I finally gathered the courage to approach him. The classroom was almost empty, and he was writing something in his notebook. "Hey," I said awkwardly. Daniel looked up at me with the same calm expression he always had. "Yeah." I hesitated for a moment before asking the question that had been in my mind for days. "Why didn't you just tell everyone who your father was from the beginning?" Daniel stared at the desk for a few seconds, thinking about the question. Then he gave a small shrug. "Because it wouldn't have changed the kind of people they were," he said calmly. "If someone treats you badly when they think you're weak, they will treat others the same way later." I didn't really know how to answer that. His words felt simple, but strangely powerful. After a moment, he closed his notebook, packed his books into his bag, and stood up. As he started walking toward the door, I asked one more question. "So what happens now?" Daniel paused near the doorway and looked back at the classroom for a second. "Now," he said quietly, "people decide what kind of person they want to be." Then he left the room and walked down the hallway, disappearing into the crowd of students. Weeks later, things slowly returned to normal at Westbrook High, but the story never disappeared completely. New students heard about it, older students remembered it, and teachers sometimes mentioned it without saying names when they talked about respect and responsibility. Because what happened that day in the gym had become something bigger than a simple fight between students. It became a reminder that actions always have consequences, even when nobody thinks they are watching. And every time I saw Daniel walking calmly through the halls, completely unbothered by the attention around him, I remembered the moment his father walked through those school doors. Because that was the day everyone at Westbrook High learned something important. The quietest person in the room might be the one who changes everything.